Hello, rock and roll rebels, and welcome to another episode of Ramble On with Rosie. This is your host, Rosie, and I am here to continue this month's topic of conversation, Mr. Paul Rodgers. Even though I have been sorely tempted to go off onto some tangents about the Clash, because there were so many important Clash anniversaries this month as well. Maybe next year I'll do that for December. In the meantime, you can check out my Instagram at Ramble On with Rosie for any of the fun Clash facts that you missed, because I'm not sharing them here because I'm still going to talk about Paul Rodgers. Anyways, this episode's particular facet of Paul Rodgers' career that we will be examining is an album he did in 2014 called The Royal Sessions. In some ways, it's similar to the Muddy Water Blues album in the fact that it's like covers very influential songs that influenced Paul Rodgers' career. But it's very different in the fact that while the Muddy Water Blues album was a homage to one specific artist and had a bunch of very famous, well-known, name recognition people on the album, with him specifically playing guitar, this album has a bunch of very famous musicians whose names are not known. In other words, they were session players. They played for High Records, some of them did, which is the record studio that predominantly recorded at the Royal Studios in Memphis, hence where the Royal Sessions gets its title from. So, to dig into a bit of a history on the players and the recording studio and High Records before we look at the album, hence why this album needed its own episode, because there's just so much to unpack even before you get to the musical content of the album. So like I said, the Royal Sessions album was recorded at the Royal Recording Studios in Memphis, which was the predominant studio used by High Records. It was actually owned and converted from a movie theater into a recording studio by the same people who owned High Records. So very convenient for them. One of those people was Willie Mitchell, whose stepson, Mr. Archie Turner, played in the high rhythm section. But before he got to that point in his career, and before he got to this Paul Rodgers album much later in his career, he was in a school band with Leroy and Charles Hodges, who are also on this album by Paul Rodgers, and also were in the high rhythm section for High Records. So, that being the case, that wasn't just it. So he wasn't just in this band at his stepfather's recording studio due to family connections. He was a very talented individual. He learned piano from his stepdad, Willie Mitchell, and when he was deployed in Vietnam, he won the Artist, or rather Entertainer of the Year in Vietnam, according to the Stars and Stripes magazine in 1969. So he definitely had the talent to back it up. Stars and Stripes magazine being a publication about all things armed forces. So he did well, came home, joined the high rhythm section, where he was also joined by those two former bandmates, Leroy and Charles Hodges. The Hodges brothers, who appear on the Paul Rodgers album, are Reverend Charles Hodges Jr., who plays Hammond B3, and Leroy Flick Hodges, who plays bass. And Charles, aside from serving as an ordained minister for decades, has also been playing his instrument on recordings, some of which he wrote, as well as, performing his Hammond organ on. And then his brother Leroy also writes and arranges as well as plays. And like I said, they're all three on here. Archie Turner is actually playing the Wurlitzer, so that's cool. So you've got the Hammond, the Wurlitzer, and the bass accounted for. Now, the next guy was not in the high rhythm section, but He did play for Stax Records, the other big label in Memphis, sort of Stax, Sun, and High Records being the big labels in Memphis for music. And an interesting thing about the Stax band is that the house band for Stax Records, especially the rhythm section, all got their start musically playing in Willie Mitchell's band, not necessarily High Rhythm section at High Records, but a separate project that he had is where the guys who ended up playing for Stax sort of got some musical, practice sort of starting in, may not have been their first band, but they played in his band and then they went to Stax, and it gave them some performance practice. So very, cool that these two record labels sort of one fed talent to the other, especially considering that Stax is more well known than High Records is and has some more notable artists than High. However, High Records did have some notable names on it. Al Green was on High Records, as was Ann Peebles and Ovi Wright and others as well. Peebles and Wright being more one-hit wonders, but most people know more than one song by Al Green. Now, back to Lester Snell Jr., who plays piano on the album and played for Stax, the guy I was talking about just a second ago. He didn't just do that. He was also in Isaac Hayes' backing band, the Isaac Hayes Movement. Now, Isaac Hayes is probably best known musically for providing the soundtrack to Shaft, and popularly best known in pop culture as the voice of Chef on South Park. I'm pointing this out because, like I said, I'm on a big Clash kick, and I don't watch a lot of South Park, but I was like, yay, Joe Strummer is in an episode, because people were talking on the anniversary of his death last week about, the South Park episode he was in. So, it all ties together in the end, as music does, which is one of my favorite things about doing what I do and researching, is the fact that, you end up finding somebody played with somebody else or did something else. It all interrelates some way, no matter what artist you're looking at, no matter how different, they may seem, you'll always find some connection, especially when you're looking at the likes of session players. You'll run the gambit with them, which we're about to do with the two drummers that are on the album, which are James E. Robertson and Steve Potts. Potts is not direct, but he is a blood relative to Alan Jackson Jr., who was in Booker T and the MGs. In fact, he was called upon to replace his relative. I don't know how they're related. The album notes on the Royal Sessions simply say that they're blood kin, so I'm going to assume it's like Alan Jackson Jr.'s nephew. And anyways, when they revived Booker T and the MGs, they called upon Potts to replace him. But back to that thing of musical, range, Potts has played on records and tours for acts ranging from the Greg Allman Band and Neil Young to Joey Molland of Badfinger, to, just name a few. So he, like most session players, they played for a lot of different people, which just makes them in some ways more interesting than the big name people that you know the names of, because, they've sat in with so many people. We'll get to my favorite session musician a little later when we're discussing the songs, but I'm not going to spoil that one yet. Anyways, Robertson, the other drummer on the album, played for Maleko Records for many years and on recordings ranging from Little Milton to Melissa Etheridge. So, yet again, like most session players, big range of artists they've played for. So, that being the case, and then there's strings, horns, and 3 backing female vocalists on this album, all of which just add this really rich depth to the fabric. Like, the music in this album it's tangible. Like, that's why I use the word fabric. It feels 3-dimensional, even though it's sound. It's just so very vivid and well arranged and perfectly accentuates Paul's voice, and it's just great. Like, highly recommend listening to. There is a slight problem there because Spotify pulled it, which pisses me off. Because I'd love to tell y'all, hey, go listen to it here. But as is, a little over half the tracks can be found in a playlist on YouTube. So that'll get you started. It's definitely worth buying if you trust my opinion on music. Highly recommend this album. I went and bought it on vinyl. I kind of wish I had bought it on Amazon because there was 3 bonus tracks that came if you did. Maybe one of these days things will get straightened out and it'll be back on music streaming services because it used to be on Spotify. I don't know what happened there. Anyways, now that we've sort of went over the pearl of this album, obviously Paul Rodgers accepted because he needs no introduction. The album itself starts off with a old Sam and Dave number called I Thank You, which was also famously done by Bad Company tour mates ZZ Top. Side note here, I thought about buying tickets to the ZZ Top 50th anniversary birthday bash, which had Cheap Trick and Bad Company opening for them, and I kick myself every time I think about it because I didn't, because all 3 of those shows were in Texas and I could have reasonably went to them. I just think I was kind of broke at that time, and I'm like, that's like the last thing that Bad Company's done as far as being on the road, and I'm like, I need this, give it back. So hopefully they'll go on the road again and I can see Paul Rodgers live and in person in performance before I or he dies. Anyways, so I Thank You opens the album, and aside from ZZ Top and Paul Rodgers, it's been covered by a multitude of artists. Everybody from Bonnie Raitt to Tom Jones. And then the second track, Down Don't Bother Me, is a standout track. It's really good. Paul's voice is excellent on it. The musicianship backing him is perfect. I mean, of course, some of these players have been playing for over 50 years, so they know what they're doing and they know how to play in with what's going on vocally and just fit right where they belong, and it's a great song. It was written by Albert King, and one of the standout things about Down Don't Bother Me is Turner's Wurlitzer on it is really good. Just adds a real special something. I'm 90% sure that's a Wurlitzer and not a regular organ. I am not good at my organology, if that's a word. So if it was regular organ and not a Wurlitzer, somebody come to Texas and kick me. But I think that's the Wurlitzer. Anyways, it's really good. Adds just extra special something to the track and makes it, a little extra, a little bit more epic and awesome. Epic isn't quite the right word because that's too big. This is just really cozy but perfectly arranged. It's just really good. It's hard to put into words. And the third track is Can't Stand the Rain, which was originally done by High Records artist Ann Peebles, and it made it to number 197 on Rolling Stone's top 500 greatest songs of all time. So that's pretty impressive just to make that list. And this version is really good. I love the Paul Rodgers version on this album. It's one of my favorite songs on the whole album. It's got really good vocals by Paul, of course, and a really full sound, and the percussion is really, really good and superb. It fits right in with the melody and the lyrics of the song and kind of sounds like Raindrops, which is great. The song's also been covered by, multiple other artists, including Tina Turner and Lil George of Little Feat, and just, it's a good song. And as I said, it was originally done by a High Records artist, Ann Peebles. Now, the next song on this wonderful album is dun, da, da, I've Been Loving You Too Long, which there's a real fun story to go with the recording of this particular track. So it originally was written and recorded by Otis Redding, And the first cover of the song was auspiciously done by the Rolling Stones. And funnily enough, they sort of did a trade-off with Otis Redding. They covered "I've Been Loving You Too Long," and then Otis covered "Satisfaction" on his next album as a sort of payback. So that was fun. And it's been later done by Ike and Tina Turner and some other artists. Uh, but it was first recorded by, uh, wait, sorry. That's all there is for that one. I was reading um, on the next track. The next track is the one with the cool backstory. My bad. I ran ahead of myself. However, like I said, "I've Been Loving You Too Long" was written and recorded by Otis Redding and covered by the Stones. But "That's How Strong My Love is the real fun story out of the recording on this album. It was recorded by High Records artist O.V. Wright, who I mentioned earlier, but covered copiously by everybody from the Stones and the Hollies to Otis Redding and Percy Sledge and Taj Mahal and Humble Pie, just to name a few. Even the Youngbloods did a version of this song. But the great thing about this particular Paul Rodgers version is the richness of his voice. It's really, really good. It's also the first track that they recorded when they were recording this album, and this is where the fun story comes in, because the players at at Royal Studios were maybe a little iffy on whether or not Paul could sing these songs, because I mean they're more true soul songs. Like, that's the thing about this album. Paul isn't singing soul songs like rock songs. He's a rock vocalist singing soul songs, like straight up in the style of Otis Redding and Sam Cooke. He's not trying to necessarily convert them into something else. He's playing them, they're arranged like soul songs. They're not arranged like rock songs. So he's using that soul side of his voice that he has and using it very well. And so, like I said, the when he first came in to record, the players at Royal Studios were a little iffy on what he could do, and so he starts out with, "That's How Strong My Love Is," and nails it in one take. Whereupon the Reverend Charles Hodges declares, "You've really got this in you. You can really do this." Like, he passed muster clearly. I mean, Charles Hodges was on the original High Records recordings playing, so he knows his stuff, and I mean, it's a pretty big compliment. I don't know personally where that ranks up with Paul Rodgers, but it's probably up there with the time that the Four Tops sang backup for him. Just as a guess. Anyways, maybe I'll do an episode on that one either. No, the backstory to that one is that he was performing with the Four Tops for like their 50th anniversary or something, and they all lined up behind him and sang backing to his lead vocal, which kind of, he hadn't expected that, and it kind of freaked him out. Here are his icons, his heroes, singing backup for him. Much like now, where the people that were on the records he idolized as a youth are playing backup instruments to them. Obviously not as much name recognition as the Four Tops, but still, on a musical level, a similar occurrence. Now, the next track is a more well-known song, which is "Walk On By." The Dionne Warwick, is it Dion or Dion? Anyway, Dionne Warwick's version that was written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David for her is like the most well-known version of this song, even though it's been covered by people like Isaac Hayes and the Average White Band and Gloria Gaynor and Cyndi Lauper. But there's an interesting thing. If you read Stevie Van Zandt's autobiography, Unrequited Infatuations, which I end up mentioning like every other episode because y'all know I'm a huge Van Zandt fan, he talks about the various ways that you can sort of make a song your own when you're covering another already popular song, which is either to like change the gender or change the arrangement or like the pacing. He mentions like that there's like 3 or 4 things you can do to increase your chances of like making it your own, even though everybody already knows it as some other musician's song. And Paul Rodgers being a man and Dionne Warwick being a woman, that helps, but he just makes this song his own with the real, like, this is probably one of the most soul, like, smooth soul songs on the record. Like, it's slow, it's good, you feel the agony, like you would on a Sam Cooke record. It's right there, and it's so good. I think this one may be one of the ones that's still up on YouTube. I really wish I knew what had went on with this album and why it's disappeared from most of the internet, because it's really problematic when I'm doing an episode on it, and I'd love for y'all to be able to listen to it. But then the seventh track on this album is Any Old Way, which is a fun, upbeat, kind of on the upbeat Sam Cooke spectrum, even though it's not a Sam Cooke song. It was actually written by Steve Cropper and Otis Redding. Cropper, of course, being the guitarist for the Stax Records house band, and has played on innumerable recordings. Like, even people who aren't, super into music have probably heard of Steve Cropper, which is pretty exemplary for a session player. Most people have never heard of session players unless they go on to become famous, like one that we're going to get to in a little bit. The next track is It's Growing, which was, funnily enough, a hit for the Temptations, but it was written by Smokey Robinson and Pete Moore of The Miracles, like, for the Temptations. They didn't even do it first, so interesting twist there. They wrote it for the Temptations, and It's Growing is a beautiful, fun, happy song. It's like Sam Cooke's I Don't Know Much About History. It's just a fun, happy, R&B, joyful song, and I love it. And this Paul Rodgers version is so good. But that moving on from there to the next song, which is slightly familiar because we discussed it a little bit last week, which is Born Under a Bad Sign, which was written by William Bell and Booker T. Jones, like Booker T of Booker T and the MG's Booker Jones, for Albert King. So those two fellas, William Bell and Booker T. Jones, wrote it for Albert King. I discussed some of it last week in my Muddy Water Blues episode, which is just, it's a good song. I mean, it's a legendary song. Most people, I feel, probably know it as the Cream version, but there's a lot to be said for Born Under a Bad Sign, and it's a fun song. So, if we're talking the vinyl edition of this album, it doesn't have Born Under a Bad Sign on it, though it is on the CD version. And then the Amazon exclusives had 3 more tracks, which were all really good. One of those was a version of Walk in My Shadow, which is great because that's a Paul Rodgers song. That's like one of the first songs, if not the first song he wrote. And here, the legends that inspired him are helping him cover one of his own songs, which really ties into the sort of letter he wrote on the credits thanking the Memphis music culture, which I will read that for you now before I get to the next 2 tracks. So, the words of Mr. Paul Rodgers in tribute to the Memphis music scene and how it inspired him, which just makes them doing one of his songs even more cooler. So what Paul said on the liner notes for the Royal Sessions is, Memphis gave the world a special kind of soul, warm, gritty, pure, and personal. Artists like Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Albert King, Ann Peebles, Isaac Hayes, and so many more gave me hope when I was an angst-filled teenager trying to make sense of it all. They were my teachers. Through their music, I learned how to live, how to be true to myself, how to tell my story as a songwriter the way I feel it. Interpreting these epic songs by these iconic artists has been a lifelong dream. I am grateful to my friends and fellow musician, Perry Margoloff, for making the Royal Sessions come to life. Recording in Memphis at Royal Studios has regenerated my faith in music, and it felt like coming home. To the ladies and gentlemen of Memphis Soul, I thank you. And Perry Margoloff was sort of the guy who gave Paul Rodgers the idea. He also produced the album, but he was down in Memphis at Royal Studios and called Paul up, who he'd been working with on a track, and was like, hey, you should come down here and record, because it's still here. Which it is one of the oldest perpetually running recording studios in the entire world. Now, after that side quest, the other two songs that are on the Amazon extras, I think Target had them possibly too on the CD, was Shake, which was originally written and recorded by Sam Cooke, and also Wonderful World, which was also written and recorded by Sam Cooke. And both songs also were covered by Otis Redding, who Otis Redding is a huge hero of Paul Rodgers. Like, if you listen to Paul Rodgers talk, the two artists he usually ends up mentioning most either as an admiration of his or an inspiration to him are usually Otis Redding and Jimi Hendrix. So Otis is really up there for Paul as an inspiration from pretty much the early days. Now, the last track is Wonderful World, like I said, which was written. And the fun thing here, I told you there was going to be a fun story about a session player. So, in the 60s, Herman's Hermits recorded the highest charting version of Wonderful World, which made it to number 4 on this track as a session player. Probably the most well-known session player, but not known for being a session player, future bandmate of Paul Rodgers, Mr. Jimmy Page, was on the recording session for Wonderful World by the Herman's Hermits. And if you don't know about Jimmy's session work, I might have to do an episode on it in January, because his birthday's in January, and people don't talk about his session work enough. He was on sessions from everything from Petula Clark's Downtown to the Goldfinger theme for the James Bond film. So, Jimmy saw it all long before he hit the road with the Yardbirds, much less Led Zeppelin, and even before he hit the road with Paul Rodgers in The Firm, which will probably be what I talk about next week, because I have to pinch myself some days to remind me that my favorite guitarist and my favorite singer were in a band together for 2 albums and 2 tours. It makes me very happy. Anyways, to close out about the Royal Sessions, it charted at number 81 on the Billboard 200 when it came out in 2014, and it entered the blues charts at number 1. So did decently well, especially for, it being 2014. R&B and soul aren't quite what they used to be, so that just makes it a little bit more special. What makes it extra special is, like mentioned in Paul Rodgers' credits letter, note, whatever you want to call that thing, is he was really inspired by the culture of Memphis, hence why he donated all the proceeds from the album to the Stax After School music program, maybe hoping to inspire the youth of the city whose music gave him inspiration to get inspired and continue making good music. Speaking of good music, one of the other exemplary things about this album is that it was recorded on analog tape. Hence why, if at all possible, get it on vinyl, so you can appreciate it as it was meant to be appreciated, given that it was recorded for analog sound. Maybe cassette tape if they ever put it on cassette tape if you can't get the vinyl. But get your hands on this album somehow, because it's so good. It's so worthwhile. If you trust me on nothing else, trust me that if you like soul and R&B, or if you like Paul Rodgers, you should like this album. If nothing else, it's impressive that he can still sing the way he did. I mean, because this is 7 years ago now. It came out in 2014, so recorded 7 or 8 years ago. So he's 72 as of December 17th. So he's in his, mid to late 60s and still spot on. So good. His voice is amazing. Like, I mean, here he is. He's in his mid 60s. He is old enough for his free coffee Sunday morning at McDonald's and just belting it and just you wouldn't think. I mean, as crazy as it sounds, his voice sounds better on the Royal sessions than it has at any other point in his career. If you're talking just like richness and quality of sound to his voice, it sounds better than it did at any other point. I'm talking Bad Company, Queen, Free, Firm, solo career. He's just got it. And he's still got it to this day, as far as I know. I mean, I don't. They haven't done enough touring and stuff in the last 7 years for him to really lose it, I don't think. I mean, hopefully they'll go on tour again and I'll be able to see them and find out firsthand. But his voice, there's a reason why he is the voice. And before I wear out my voice, I'm going to let y'all go. And I hope that you have a wonderful week. Be kind to each other, rock on, and I will be back with more rambles next week. Merry Christmas, everybody.